Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are asking a pretty massive question, one that gets right to the heart of how we understand the past. We're looking at a perspective that could change how you see, well, everything you've ever learned about national history. So let's just dive right in with the big one. Is the history that happens inside a country's borders actually its own? I mean, you'd think so, right? It seems obvious. But the source material we're digging into today says, not so fast. It argues that those neat lines on a modern map might actually be hiding the real story. All right, section 1. Let's get into it. The whole argument really kicks off with that classic saying, history is written by the victors. It's not necessarily what happened, but a version of it, crafted after the dust has settled. Think about that for a second. The history we learn is almost never the actual reality people lived through. Instead, it's a story put together, reconstructed by later generations. And that means the perspectives of the people who lost, the people who were conquered, well, their stories often just vanish. Okay, so let's look at a couple of concrete examples. You've got Yuan Dynasty China, which was ruled by the Mongols. They were the victors. The Han Chinese were the ones who were conquered. Then you have Japanese-occupied Joseon. Japan was the victor, the Joseon people were the losers. This forces us to ask, is the Yuan Dynasty Chinese history? Or is it Mongolian history that just happened to take place on that piece of land? The answer completely changes how we think about a country's identity.
Okay, for the next part, to really build this case, the source does something interesting. It deconstructs one of the most basic ideas in this whole debate, the word China itself.
So, get this. The word we translate as China, 中国, it didn't originally mean a massive nation, not even close. Way back in the Zhou Dynasty, it basically just meant the capital city. It was a name for one specific, small area in the Luyong Basin. It was a place, not a country. And here is the absolute kicker. The whole idea of China as a unified country as we know it today, that's super modern. It only really started in 1912. So every time we talk about ancient China, we're kind of forcing a modern political concept onto a past where it just didn't exist. And this quote from the historian Shen Jiandan just hits the nail on the head. He argues that the concept of a single, continuous Chinese nation is, well, a kind of political fiction, that the original inherent territory of the Han Chinese people was really just that one small basin. So if the idea of China as we know it is a pretty new invention, what does that do to its history? Well, the source presents a pretty radical rereading of the dynasties by asking a very simple question. Who was actually in charge? Now, this timeline, it's a real eye-opener. According to this analysis, many of China's most legendary dynasties weren't ruled by Han Chinese at all. The Shang, ruled by the Dongyi people. The incredible Sui and Tang dynasties, led by people of mixed Xianbei blood. The Yuan was the Mongols, and the last dynasty, the Qing, was the Manchu people. For huge stretches of time, the folks running the show were what this source calls outsiders. And all of that leads to this one absolutely staggering number, 4,200. Out of a 4,600-year period, that is how long the source claims the Han Chinese were actually ruled by other groups. Just let that sink in. That's over 90% of the time.
So you might be thinking, okay, interesting history lesson, but why does it matter now? Well, it matters a lot, because this isn't just an academic debate. This stuff is directly connected to modern political tensions.
Let's talk about these ancient Korean kingdoms, Goryeo, Goryeo, and the others. Here's the thing. Their old territories stretched into land that is now, today, inside the borders of China. And that historical overlap creates a huge puzzle with very real political stakes. So here's the billion-dollar question. If you define history only by the lines on today's maps, then whose kingdoms are these? Does Goguryeu's history now belong to China? Or does it stay Korean, no matter where the border is? National pride and entire national stories are riding on the answer. And this isn't just some theoretical what if. The source points to a very real example, a state-sponsored research program in China called the Northeast Project that started around 2002. And the argument is, this was not just for academic curiosity. It had a clear political agenda. So what was that agenda? According to the source, the project's goal was to essentially absorb the history of ancient Korean states like Goryeo and claim them as part of China's own national story.
It's a textbook case of using that history within our borders logic to go back and claim another culture's heritage.
There's actually an academic framework for this whole idea. It's called the conquest dynasty theory. A scholar named Carl Wittfogel said, look, we have to make a distinction between typical Chinese dynasties and these conquest dynasties, the ones started by outsiders like the Mongols or the Manchus. You can't just lump them all together and call them all Chinese. It's just a massive oversimplification.
So if history isn't just about who controlled what piece of dirt, what's the alternative? How are we supposed to think about the past then? The source proposes this really fascinating shift. What if true history isn't about who owned the land, but about who inherited the ideas? It's a move away from geography and towards culture, from physical control to intellectual inheritance. The real question isn't who ruled, but who carried the torch of that civilization forward. And really, it all comes down to this. True history is supposed to be about the facts, right? Not embellished or beautified to make a country or particular group look good. The goal should be to get as close as we can to what was actually recorded, without all the layers of political spin that get added on later. And that's the final thought we're left with. It's a really provocative one. If history can be rewritten, if it can be used as a political tool, how do any of us ever really know if we're getting the truth? It challenges us to look critically at every single historical story we've ever been told and to always, always ask, whose history is this really?